The gravy boat shattered against the mahogany table, splashing brown liquid all over the pristine white lace tablecloth I had ironed with my own aching hands just hours before. The silence that followed was deafening, heavier than the oak beams above our heads. My son, Robert, usually so composed in his expensive Italian suits, was standing up, his face a shade of crimson that clashed with the festive holly decorations. His hands were gripping the edge of the table so hard, his knuckles were white. "You sold it?" he screamed, his voice cracking like a teenager's, stripping away all the pretense of the polite, successful architect. "You sold the family home without consulting us, without a vote?" My daughter Clara sat frozen, her fork hovering halfway to her mouth, a piece of roast potato trembling on the tines. Her eyes weren't on me, though. They were darting around the room, scanning the crown molding, the crystal chandelier, the view of the snow-covered garden through the French windows, calculating the millions she had just lost. "Where is the money, Mother?" Robert demanded, leaning over the ruined tablecloth, ignoring the gravy dripping onto the carpet. "That house is worth a fortune. It is our inheritance. Where is the money?" I looked at them, really looked at them. I saw the greed etched into the lines around their eyes, lines that used to crinkle with laughter when they were children. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my red wine. It tasted dry, earthy, and victorious. I placed the glass down gently, making sure not to stain the coaster. I smiled, a genuine, soft smile. But wait, how did we get to this shouting match? How did a quiet Christmas dinner turn into a battlefield of broken china and broken dreams? To understand why I smiled while my children screamed, I have to take you back to where this really started. Not 5 minutes ago, but months ago. Back to the silence. It began with the quiet. If you have never lived alone in a house meant for a large family, you cannot understand the specific weight of that silence. It is a physical thing. It settles on your shoulders like a damp wool shawl. This house, this beautiful, sprawling Victorian beast of a house that my late husband and I bought 40 years ago, had become a mausoleum. It was early November when the reality hit me. I was sitting in the blue armchair by the window, the one where the springs are a bit shot, watching the rain strip the last golden leaves from the oak trees. My tea had gone cold. The house was spotless. It was always spotless because no one lived here but me. There were no muddy boots in the hallway, no school bags thrown on the sofa, no laughter echoing down the staircase. I looked at the calendar on the kitchen wall. It was one of those free ones from the pharmacy with pictures of kittens. The squares for September and October were completely blank. No birthdays, no visits. "No Sunday lunch," scribbled in marker. "Just the doctor's appointments," I wrote in with a shaky hand. The phone sat on the side table like a dormant animal. I found myself staring at it, willing it to ring. I wanted to hear Clara's voice, even if she was just complaining about her husband. I wanted to hear Robert tell me about his big projects. But the phone only rang for telemarketers or automated scams. I remember the day I decided to test the waters. It was a Tuesday. My arthritis was flaring up in my hips, a dull, grinding pain that made walking from the kitchen to the living room feel like a pilgrimage. I dialed Robert's number. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice clipped and impatient. "Mom, is everything okay? I'm in a meeting." "I just wanted to say hello, Robert," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, trying not to sound like the needy old woman I feared I was becoming. "I was wondering if you might come by this weekend. I made that apple pie you like." A sigh. A loud, exasperated sigh that hurt more than my hip. Mom, we're swamped. The kids have soccer and Linda has her yoga retreat. We can't just drive 2 hours for pie. We'll see you at Christmas. That's only 6 weeks away. 6 weeks. 42 days. 1,008 hours of silence. I hung up and called Clara. She didn't answer. Can't talk. Busy. Everything good? See you Xmas. See you Xmas. That was the ritual. The annual ritual of absence. For 11 months of the year, I was a ghost to them. I was the caretaker of their future asset. They didn't see me as their mother. They saw me as the custodian of the real estate. They checked in only enough to ensure the investment was still standing and that I hadn't burned it down by leaving the stove on. I walked up the stairs that afternoon, gripping the banister with both hands, pulling my weight up step by agonizing step. I went into the guest rooms. Robert's old room still had his trophies on the shelf. Clara's room still had the pink wallpaper she used to love. The air in there was stale, smelling of dust and old memories. I sat on the edge of Clara's bed and looked around. I was maintaining a shrine for people who didn't want to be here. I was heating a 5-bedroom house for one cold woman. I was paying for gardeners to trim hedges that no one looked at but me. I thought about Christmas past, the way they would sweep in on December 24th, their cars trunk-heavy with gifts. They would complain about the drive. They would complain about the draft in the hallway. They would eat my food, the turkey I spent 2 days prepping, the stuffing made from scratch with bread I'd dried myself, and they would be on their phones half the time. And then, invariably, the conversation would turn to the house. "It's getting to be too much for you, isn't it, Mom?" Robert would say, looking at the roof with a contractor's eye. "The market is really hot right now in this area," Clara would add, sipping my vintage wine. "You could get a nice little apartment, something assisted." They weren't worried about my hips. They were worried about the roof leaking and lowering the resale value. They were already spending the money in their heads. I could see it. Robert wanted a boat. Clara wanted a vacation home in Tuscany. Sitting on that pink bedspread, shivering slightly from the chill of the unheated room, something inside me snapped. It wasn't a loud snap like the gravy boat would be later. It was quiet. It was the sound of a final thread giving way. Why was I suffering to keep this museum open for visitors who only came once a year to check the inventory? I stood up. My knees popped, but I felt a strange surge of energy. I walked over to the mirror on the back of the door. I saw an old woman with gray hair and a cardigan that was too big for her shrinking frame. But in my eyes, I saw Beatrice, the Beatrice who had raised 2 children, buried a husband, and survived 80 years on this earth. "I am not a caretaker," I whispered to the empty room. "I am a person." I went downstairs and made myself a fresh pot of coffee, strong coffee. I didn't sit in the sad blue armchair. I sat at the head of the dining table. I took out a notepad and a pen. The house was worth millions. The neighborhood had gentrified. Young tech millionaires were buying up these old estates. If they only visit for Christmas, I thought, tapping the pen against the wood, then Christmas is all they get. I didn't call Robert back. I didn't text Clara. Instead, I opened the phone book. Yes, I still use a phone book, and looked for a number I had seen on a billboard. The next few weeks were a blur of activity that I had to keep entirely secret. It was thrilling. For the first time in years, the phone rang constantly. But it wasn't family. It was potential buyers, inspectors, and the agent, a lovely young man named David, who drank my tea and actually listened when I told him stories about the garden. David asked me, "Do you want to consult your children, Mrs. Beatrice?" Usually in these cases. I cut him off with a look that could freeze water. My name is on the deed, David. Only my name. They have their own houses. This is my house, and I am selling it. I packed boxes at night. I hired a private company to move the things I truly cared about. The photo albums, my husband's watch, my favorite books, the comfortable chair, to a storage unit. I left everything else. The furniture, the beds, the heavy curtains. I sold the house as is, fully furnished. The closing date was set for December 20th, 4 days before Christmas. I requested a lease back for 1 week. I told the new owners I need to host one last Christmas dinner. Just one. It's a tradition. They were charming about it. Take all the time you need, Beatrice, they said. So when December 24th arrived, the house looked exactly the same as it always did. The wreath was on the door, the tree was up, decorated with the ornaments Robert and Clara had made in kindergarten. The turkey was in the oven, filling the cold hallways with the scent of sage and roasting meat. But the closets were empty. My jewelry box was gone. The deed in the safe was gone. I dressed in my best velvet dress. I put on my pearls. I waited by the window. At 4 p.m., a sleek black car pulled up. Robert. At 4:15 p.m., a silver SUV. Clara. They walked in with the cold air clinging to their coats, shaking off snow, bringing in the noise and the chaos. "Merry Christmas, Mom!" Clara pecked my cheek, her eyes already scanning the room. "God, it's freezing in here. Did you turn the heat down to save money again?" "Hi, Mom," Robert said, handing me a bottle of wine that I knew cost less than the tie he was wearing. "Place looks old. We really need to talk about the roof this year." I saw a shingle loose. I took their coats. I hung them up. I smiled that tight, polite smile I had worn for 10 years. "Come in," I said. "Dinner is almost ready." We sat down. We went through the motions. They talked about their lives, their stresses, their busy schedules. They didn't ask me a single question about my year. They didn't notice that the painting over the fireplace was gone, replaced by a cheap print I found in the attic. They didn't notice that the silver candlesticks were missing. They ate, they drank, and then, as I knew they would, they brought it up. "So, Mom," Robert started, wiping his mouth with the napkin, "we've been talking, Clara and I. We think it's time to get serious about the estate planning. This house is a lot of capital tied up in a decaying asset." Clara nodded eagerly. "We found a great facility, Mom. It's like a resort, really. And if we sell now, before the market dips?" I looked at them. I looked at the turkey carcass. I looked at the snow falling outside, covering the garden that didn't belong to me anymore. I cleared my throat. The sound was soft, but it cut through their chatter instantly. "You don't have to worry about the market," I said, my voice steady, my heart pounding a rhythm of pure adrenaline, "or the roof, or the capital." Robert frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I said, reaching for my wine glass, "that I took care of it." "You did?" Clara asked, surprised. "You hired a contractor?" "No," I said. "I sold it." And that brings us back to the crash. The gravy boat exploding, the scream, the red face of my son, the terror in my daughter's eyes. Where is the money? Robert yelled again, vibrating with rage. I looked him dead in the eye. The silence of the last 10 years was gone, replaced by the beautiful sound of consequences. I smiled. "I spent it," I lied. "Well, not all of it, but enough to make sure I never have to spend another Christmas waiting for a phone that doesn't ring." And then I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It wasn't a check, it was a brochure. I placed it on the table, right next to the spilled gravy. Robert snatched it up. His hands were shaking. "A world cruise?" he read, his voice breathless. "The ultra-luxury world voyage? Departed yesterday?" "I'm flying out tomorrow to catch the ship in Lisbon," I said calmly, "and I'm not coming back." The silence that followed my declaration was different from the silence that had filled this house for the last decade. That old silence was heavy, dusty, and lonely. This new silence was sharp. It was the sound of a guillotine blade that had just dropped, and we were all waiting to see where the head would roll. Robert stared at the glossy brochure in his hand as if it were a venomous snake. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. It was Clara who broke the paralysis. She reached across the table, her manicured nails digging into the tablecloth, and snatched the paper from her brother's trembling grip. Her eyes scanned the itinerary, widening with every port of call. "Lisbon? Cape Town? Singapore?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of horror and disbelief. "Mother, this costs more than my house. This is madness. This is absolute madness." "It is my madness," I said softly, picking up my knife and fork. I cut a small piece of turkey. It was cold now, the gravy congealing on the plate, but I forced myself to eat it. I needed the strength. Robert finally found his voice. It came out as a low growl, vibrating deep in his chest. He pushed his chair back, the wooden legs screeching against the floorboards, a sound that made me wince. He began to pace the length of the dining room, his expensive leather shoes thudding against the Persian rug that had been a wedding gift from his father. "You are not going anywhere," he stated, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You are 80 years old. You have arthritis. You take medication for your blood pressure. You cannot just disappear on a boat. And you certainly cannot liquidate the family estate without power of attorney involvement. I will call Dr. Evans. Clearly, you are having an episode." I put my fork down. The metal clinked against the china. I looked at my son, this tall, broad-shouldered stranger who used to run to me when he scraped his knee. Now, he was looking at me not with concern, but with a clinical, calculating assessment. He wasn't seeing his mother. He was seeing a liability. He was seeing a leak in his financial reservoir. "I am not having an episode, Robert," I said, keeping my voice level, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "And I did not liquidate the family estate. I sold my house, the one I scrubbed, the one I paid the mortgage on for 20 years after your father died while you were busy buying sports cars." "But it was our home," Clara wailed, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. I watched them fall, trying to discern if they were real. They looked real, but were they for me or for the inheritance that had just sailed away? We grew up here. We have memories here. You sold our memories to strangers. I felt a sudden, hot flare of anger in my chest. It burned brighter than the fireplace. "Your memories?" I asked, my voice rising just a fraction. "Clara, when was the last time you visited those memories? Was it last July when I fell in the garden and lay there for an hour because I didn't have my phone? I called you the next day. You told me to be more careful and then complained that your housekeeper had stolen a silver spoon. Or was it 3 years ago when I spent my 77th birthday alone because you and Robert were both too swamped to drive down?" They fell silent. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly. Tick, tock, tick, tock, counting down the seconds of their discomfort. I stood up. My legs felt shaky, but I locked my knees and held on to the edge of the table. I looked around the room. The shadows were lengthening in the corners. The Christmas tree lights twinkled, indifferent to the devastation in the room. "This house is not a memory bank for you," I said, looking from one to the other. "It is a waiting room. You were waiting for me to die." Robert stopped pacing. He turned to face me, his face draining of color. "That is a terrible thing to say." "Is it?" I asked. I walked slowly over to the sideboard where I kept the family albums. I didn't open them. I just touched the leather spines. "Every time you call, Robert, you ask about the roof. Every time you call, Clara, you ask if I'm still managing the stairs. You aren't asking about my health. You are asking about the structural integrity of your asset. You wanted to know if the investment was secure. Well, I decided to diversify my portfolio." I saw the realization hit them. It wasn't shame, not yet. It was panic. Pure financial panic. Robert ran a hand through his thinning hair. Okay, let's calm down. You sold the house. Fine, the deal is done. But the money, Mom, you said you spent it, but that's impossible. A house like this goes for $2 million in this market. You can't spend $2 million on a cruise ticket. Where is the rest of the capital? We need to put it in a trust, for your care, for when you get back. I looked at him, at the sweat beading on his upper lip. He was already trying to salvage the wreckage. He was trying to take control back. I smiled again. It was easier this time. "I didn't say I spent it all on the ticket," I said, moving toward the hallway. "I told you. I'm leasing the house back for the week. The movers are coming on the 27th. But the money, oh, the money has been very busy." "Where?" Clara demanded, standing up now, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing mascara across her cheek. "Is it in your account? We need to see the statements. Mom, people take advantage of the elderly. We need to protect you." "Protect me?" I laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound. "You want to protect me now? Where were you when the boiler broke last winter and I slept in a coat for 3 days because I couldn't reach the repairman and you wouldn't answer your phones? Where was the protection then?" I walked into the hallway. They followed me, like two puppies who had been kicked but were still hungry. The air in the hallway was colder. The draft from the door was sharp. "I didn't put the money in a trust," I said, turning to face them at the bottom of the stairs. "I set up an endowment." "A what?" Robert asked, his voice cracking. "A charitable endowment," I lied. "Partially. I donated a significant portion to the local hospice, the one that took care of your father. The one you two visited exactly once. And the rest? Well, the rest is in an account you cannot access. It is linked to my debit card, and I intend to swipe that card in every port from Lisbon to Tokyo until the machine declines." Robert looked like he was going to be sick. He leaned against the wall, clutching his chest. "You gave it away? You gave our inheritance to a hospice?" "It wasn't your inheritance, Robert," I said firmly. "It was my life. It was my sweat. It was my loneliness. And now it is my freedom." Clara stepped forward, her face twisting into a mask of ugly desperation. "Think of the grandchildren, Mother. Little Sophie needs braces. Jack is starting private school next year. How could you be so selfish?" I looked at Clara. I thought of Sophie and Jack. Sweet children. I sent them checks every birthday. I knitted them sweaters they never wore. I asked to see them, and I was told they were too busy with soccer or ballet or coding camp. "I am doing this for them," I said quietly. Clara blinked. "What?" "I am teaching them a lesson you two never learned," I said. I am teaching them that people are not furniture. You cannot leave them in a corner for years and expect them to be there when you finally decide to sit down. The doorbell rang. The sound was jarring in the tense atmosphere. It was a cheerful, bright ding-dong that belonged to a different world. "Who is that?" Robert snapped, jumping as if he'd been shot. "That will be my taxi," I said. "Taxi? But you said you were flying tomorrow," Clara said, confused. "I am," I replied, "but I'm staying at the airport hotel tonight. I have an early flight, and frankly, I don't think I can stomach any more of this turkey, or this conversation." I walked to the closet and pulled out my coat. It was a new coat, cashmere, bought with the deposit money. It felt soft and warm, a stark contrast to the chill radiating from my children. I put it on, buttoning it slowly, my fingers fumbling slightly but managing the task. I wound a silk scarf around my neck. I picked up the small suitcase I had hidden behind the coats earlier that day. "You can't leave," Robert said. He was standing in front of the door, blocking my path. His face was red, his eyes wild. "Mom, be reasonable. We can undo this. We can call the lawyers in the morning. We can say you were coerced." "Move, Robert," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it had a steel core I hadn't felt in years. He didn't move. "You are not walking out that door with the family fortune in your purse." I reached into my purse. He flinched, perhaps expecting a weapon. I pulled out a single envelope. "This is for you," I said, handing it to him. He took it, his hands shaking violently. "Is this the check?" "No," I said. "It's the list of things the new owners agreed to keep, and the contact number for the storage unit where I put your father's things. You have until the 27th to clear out anything else you want. After that, the junk haulers come." Robert looked at the envelope, then back at me. The greed in his eyes was slowly being replaced by a dawn of horror. He was realizing that I wasn't senile. I wasn't confused. I was leaving. I stepped forward. He was a big man, my son, but he shrank back as I approached. He stepped aside. I opened the front door. The cold winter air rushed in, smelling of snow and pine needles. It felt like oxygen. It felt like life. The taxi was waiting at the curb, its headlights cutting through the gloom of the late afternoon. I turned back one last time. Clara was sobbing into the new cashmere coat I had bought myself, but she wasn't hugging me. She was just holding onto the doorframe. Robert was staring at the envelope. "The table is still set," I said. "Enjoy the wine. It's a 1998 vintage, very expensive. I charged it to the house account before we closed." "Goodbye," I said. And then, for the first time in 40 years, I walked out of that house and didn't worry about whether I had locked the back door. I didn't worry if the heat was too high. I didn't worry if the silence was too loud. I walked down the snowy path, my boots crunching on the ice. I didn't look back at the window to see if they were watching. I knew they weren't watching me. They were looking at the walls, trying to figure out if there was any copper wiring they could strip before the 27th. I got into the taxi. The driver, a man with a kind face and a thick mustache, smiled at me in the rearview mirror. "Airport hotel, ma'am?" "Yes, please," I said, settling back into the seat. "And turn the radio up. I love music." As we pulled away, I closed my eyes. I expected to feel guilt. A mother should feel guilt when she abandons her children, shouldn't she? But as the house disappeared around the bend, swallowed by the gray winter twilight and the falling snow, I felt only one thing. I felt the weight of the damp wool shawl lifting from my shoulders. But I knew, even as the heater in the taxi warmed my frozen feet, that this wasn't over. Robert was litigious. Clara was spiteful. They wouldn't let $2 million sail away without a fight. I had fired the first shot, but the war had just begun. My phone buzzed in my purse. I ignored it, let it ring, let it echo in the silence I had left behind. The taxi smelled faintly of pine air freshener and old leather. It was a smell I would never forget because it was the scent of my escape. The driver, the man with the mustache, hummed a tune I didn't recognize, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel. He had no idea that the old woman in his back seat, clutching a purse like a lifeline, had just detonated a nuclear bomb in the middle of a suburban dining room. My heart was doing things it shouldn't. It fluttered in my chest, skipping beats, a sensation that usually sent me reaching for my blood pressure monitor. But tonight, I let it flutter. I looked out the window at the passing streetlights. They smeared into long streaks of yellow and white against the wet glass. Each light we passed was one step further away from the gravy boat, the cold turkey, and the accusations. The phone in my purse buzzed again, and again. It was a relentless, angry vibration against my hip. I pulled it out. The screen lit up the dark interior of the cab. 12 missed calls. 8 missed calls. Calling. I stared at the name, my son, the boy I had nursed through chickenpox, the man I had bailed out of credit card debt 3 times in his 20s. Now he was just a name on a screen, frantic because the Bank of Mom had finally closed its doors. I pressed the side button to silence it, but I didn't turn it off. I needed to know what they were planning. We arrived at the airport hotel. It wasn't the Ritz, but to me, the sliding glass doors looked like the gates of heaven. The lobby was warm and smelled of industrial cleaning polish and coffee. It was busy, full of people dragging suitcases, families arguing over passports, businessmen shouting into headsets. Nobody looked at me. Nobody cared about my roof or my will. I was invisible, and for the first time in years, my invisibility felt like a superpower. I checked in. The young woman at the desk had bright pink nails and a tired smile. "One night, Mrs. Sterling?" she asked, typing on her keyboard. "Yes," I said. "I have a flight to Lisbon in the morning." She looked up, her eyes widening slightly. "Lisbon? That's lovely. Going to visit family?" "No," I said, signing the receipt with a hand that was surprisingly steady. "I am going to visit myself. I haven't seen her in a very long time." She didn't understand, but she smiled anyway and handed me the keycard. Room 412. The elevator ride was smooth. I leaned against the mirrored wall and looked at my reflection. The velvet dress was wrinkled. My hair was a little flat on one side. I looked like a tired old woman. But my eyes looked different. The dull, watery gray film of resignation was gone. They looked sharp. They looked awake. I opened the door to room 412. It was a standard room. 2 queen beds, a generic abstract painting on the wall, a television inside a cabinet. I locked the door. I threw the deadbolt. Then I put the security latch on. Only then did I sit down on the edge of the bed. The mattress was firm, much harder than my bed at home. Home. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. I thought of the house I had just left. By now, the shock would be wearing off. He would be pacing the kitchen, making lists. Clara would be checking the silver to see what else I might have sold. They wouldn't be cleaning up the dinner plates. They would leave that mess, just like they always did, assuming the house elves would take care of it. But the house elf had retired. My phone chimed. A voicemail. I hesitated. My finger hovered over the play button. I knew I shouldn't listen. I should take a hot shower and sleep. But fear is a habit, and I had been afraid of disappointing them for 40 years. I pressed play, speakerphone on. Robert's voice filled the small hotel room. It was tight, controlled, the voice he used when he was threatening a contractor. "Mom, pick up the phone. This isn't funny. Clara is having a panic attack. We are calling Dr. Evans. You are clearly not in your right mind. You cannot just sell a property of that value without legal counsel. I've already called the police non-emergency line to file a missing person report because we are worried about your mental state. If you are at a hotel, tell us. We are coming to get you. Don't do anything else with the money. Do not spend a dime. We love you, Mom, but you are sick. Call me. The message ended with a beep that sounded like a gavel coming down. I sat there in the silence of the hotel room, the air conditioner humming a low, monotonous tune. Sick, that was their angle. Of course, they wouldn't argue about the money. That made them look greedy. They would argue about my sanity. That made them look like concerned children. If they could prove I was incompetent, they could freeze the accounts. They could void the sale. They could drag me back to that house and put me in the guest room with a nurse until I died properly, on their schedule, leaving the estate intact. A cold shiver went through me, sharper than the winter wind outside. They weren't just angry, they were dangerous. I stood up, my knees popping. I walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot. Snow was falling harder now, swirling under the sodium lights. I had to be smarter than them. I had the money, yes. But they had the energy of youth and the entitlement of a lifetime. I opened my purse and took out the brochure for the cruise. The ship, the Queen Elizabeth, was docked in Lisbon. Once I was on that ship in international waters, it would be much harder for them to reach me. But I had to get there first. I looked at my phone again. Another voicemail from Clara. I played it. Mom, it's me. Look, I'm sorry I yelled about the house. It's a shock. But Robbie is really mad. He's talking about power of attorney. He's calling your bank, Mom. He knows the manager at the branch on Main Street. Please, just come back. We can fix this. We can get you a nice apartment. You don't want to be alone on a boat. You get seasick, remember? Please. Her voice wavered, sounding like the little girl who used to cry when her ice cream fell in the sand. But I heard the threat underneath the tears. He's calling the bank. My stomach churned. The check from the house sale had cleared yesterday. I had moved the funds to a new account at a different bank, an international one, precisely for this reason. But Robert was tenacious. If he claimed fraud or elder abuse, he could cause problems. I needed to make a call, not to them. I dialed a number I had written in my address book under handyman. It wasn't a handyman. It was Mr. Henderson, the lawyer who had helped me sell the house in secret. He was semi-retired, a man who despised Robert ever since my son tried to sue him over a fence line dispute 10 years ago. He answered on the second ring. Beatrice, is everything all right? It's Christmas Eve. They know, I said. My voice sounded stronger than I felt. I told them. There was a pause. Then a chuckle that sounded like dry leaves rustling. How did they take it? Poorly, I said. Robert is threatening to declare me incompetent. He says he's called the police to report me missing. He's calling the banks. Mr. Henderson sighed. I warned you he would try the competency angle. Listen to me, Beatrice. You have the evaluation from Dr. Klein from last week, right? The one stating you are of sound mind and excellent cognitive health? It's in my suitcase, I said, glancing at the floral bag on the luggage rack. Good. Keep it with your passport. And don't worry about the police. If they show up, you show them that paper. You are an adult. You are allowed to move. You are allowed to spend your money. Robert is blustering. He's trying to scare you back into the box. He's coming to find me, I whispered. He said he's coming to get me. He doesn't know where you are, does he? No. Then lock your door, order room service, and get on that plane. Once you're in Europe, the jurisdiction gets messy. He won't spend his own money to chase you across the Atlantic. He's too cheap for that. I smiled. Mr. Henderson knew my son well. Thank you, Arthur, I said. Merry Christmas, Beatrice. Enjoy the wine. I hung up. I felt a little better, but the adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. My hands were trembling as I unzipped my suitcase. I pulled out my nightgown, a silk one I had bought for the trip, not the flannel sacks I usually wore. I wanted to feel elegant. I went into the bathroom to wash my face. The fluorescent light was harsh. I looked at the wrinkles around my mouth, the sagging skin of my neck. I touched the mirror. "Who are you?" I asked the reflection. For years, I was Robert's mother, Clara's mother, the widow, the babysitter, the checkbook. Tonight, I was just Beatrice, and Beatrice was terrified. I splashed water on my face. As I dried it with the fluffy hotel towel, a sudden, loud pounding on the door made me jump. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Mrs. Sterling?" A deep male voice boomed through the door. "Police, open up, please." I froze. The towel dropped from my hands. Robert. He hadn't just called the police. He had actually sent them. He must have tracked my phone. "Mrs. Sterling, we have a report of a confused elderly female. We need to do a wellness check." I gripped the edge of the sink. My knuckles turned white. This was it. This was the moment where I either crumbled and went back to being a piece of furniture, or I stood tall. I walked out of the bathroom. I didn't rush. I smoothed my velvet dress. I picked up the folder from my suitcase containing Dr. Klein's letter and my passport. I walked to the door. I didn't undo the latch yet. "I am not confused, officer," I said through the wood. My voice was loud, clear, and angry. "Ma'am, your son is very worried. He's on the line with dispatch. He says you might be having a medical episode. Please open the door so we can verify you're safe." I took a deep breath. The smell of the hotel room, coffee, and polish filled my lungs. I undid the latch. I turned the deadbolt. I opened the door. 2 police officers stood there. They looked young, impossibly young, with snow melting on their shoulders. And behind them, standing near the elevator, breathless and red-faced, wearing his coat but no scarf, was Robert. He had found me. "Mom!" he shouted, pushing past the officers before they could stop him. "Thank God!" He reached for me. His hands were cold and wet. He grabbed my shoulders, his grip hard, possessive. "You're coming home," he said, his eyes scanning the room, looking for the money, looking for the madness. "You're coming home right now." I looked at the officers. Then I looked at my son. "Get your hands off me," I said. The silence in the hallway was absolute. Robert blinked, stunned. He had never heard that tone from me, not once. I stepped back, breaking his grip. I turned to the officers and held up the letter from Dr. Klein. "Officers," I said, my voice shaking but holding firm, "this is a medical evaluation from 3 days ago stating I am perfectly sane. This is my passport, and this man is trespassing on my vacation." I pointed a trembling finger at Robert. "Please him," I said, "or I will press charges for harassment." Robert's mouth fell open. "Mom, have you lost your mind? I'm your son." "No," I said, feeling tears prick my eyes, hot and painful. "You were my son when you wanted dinner. You were my son when you wanted a loan. Right now, you are just a man who is angry that his inheritance is spending the night at the Hilton." I looked the younger officer in the eye. "I am safe, I am fine, and I want him gone." The officer looked at the letter. He looked at me. Then he looked at Robert, who was vibrating with rage and embarrassment. Sir, the officer said, stepping between us, you need to step back. But Robert stammered. She seems fine to me, sir. The officer turned to me. Do you want him to leave, ma'am? Yes, I said. Sir, let's go. The officer put a hand on Robert's chest. Robert looked at me over the officer's shoulder. His eyes were wide with shock, but beneath the shock, I saw the hatred. It was a cold, hard thing. You'll regret this, he spat out. You'll die alone, Mom. You hear me? You'll die alone on that boat, and we won't even come to claim the body. The words hit me like physical blows. They were the worst things a mother could hear. But as I watched the elevator doors close on his furious red face, I realized something. I had been dying alone in that big house for 10 years. At least on the boat, there would be an ocean view. I closed the door, I locked it, I latched it, and then I slid down to the floor, burying my face in the velvet dress, and I wept. Not for the house, not for the money, but for the son I had lost long before tonight. I cried until my throat hurt, until the carpet pattern was imprinted on my cheek. But when I finally stood up and washed my face again, I didn't call him back. I packed my bag, I laid out my clothes for the morning. I was going to Lisbon. And I was going to drink every drop of champagne they had. The red digital numbers on the hotel alarm clock changed to 4 a.m. I hadn't slept, not really. I had just lain there in the dark, listening to the hum of the mini fridge and the thumping of my own heart, replaying the look on Robert's face when the elevator doors closed. Hate. It was pure hate. A mother knows her child's faces, the hungry face, the tired face, the lying face. But I had never seen the hate face until last night. It was a cold, unfamiliar mask that chilled me more than the blizzard outside. I swung my legs out of bed. My ankles were stiff, protesting the cold floor. My body felt heavy, like an old coat soaked in rain, but my mind was vibrating with a terrified energy. I couldn't stay here. If Robert was angry enough to bring the police last night, he would be angry enough to bring a lawyer this morning. He would try to freeze the accounts. He would try to ground me. I moved through the morning ritual with the precision of a soldier. Shower, hot water hitting the back of my neck, trying to loosen the knot of tension there. Support hose, comfortable shoes. Well, I wasn't going to the grocery store. I checked my phone one last time. No new messages. The silence was worse than the ringing. It meant they were plotting. It meant they had moved past the stage of emotional outbursts and into the stage of cold calculation. Robert was likely sitting in my kitchen right now, drinking my coffee, going through my drawers, looking for the bank statements I had shredded 3 days ago. I went down to the lobby. It was empty, save for a janitor mopping the floor with gray, soapy water. The smell of ammonia stung my nose. I checked out, paying with cash. I didn't want a paper trail appearing on a credit card statement just yet. "Taxi, please," I told the sleepy doorman. "International Terminal." The ride to the airport was a blur of dark highways and taillights. I clutched my purse against my chest. Inside was the folder, the doctor's note, the passport, the boarding pass I had printed at the hotel business center, and the credit card, the black card linked to the new international account. That card was my lifeline. If Robert had managed to call his friend at the bank, if he had managed to flag my identity, that card would be a useless piece of plastic, and I would be an old woman stranded in a terminal with nothing but a suitcase full of regrets. The airport was assault on the senses. Bright fluorescent lights, the clatter of wheels on linoleum, the garbled announcements over the loudspeaker. Everyone moved so fast. Young people with backpacks, businessmen thumbing at their phones, mothers dragging toddlers. I felt small. I felt slow. I felt like a ghost haunting a machine. I found the check-in counter for the airline. I had booked a first-class ticket. It cost $6,000. Before yesterday, spending $6,000 on a flight would have given me a stroke. I used to clip coupons for 50 cents off laundry detergent. But today, I walked to the priority carpet. The agent was a woman with kind eyes and a silk scarf tied perfectly around her neck. "Passport," she said. My hand trembled as I handed it over. This was the moment. If there was a flag, if the police had put a hold on me, the computer would beep. She would frown, she would pick up the phone. She typed, click, click, click. She frowned at the screen. My breath caught in my throat. My lungs burned. I gripped the counter, my knuckles white. "Let me just refresh the system," she muttered. "It's being slow this morning." I forced a smile. It felt like cracking plaster. "Take your time, dear." She typed again. Then the sound of the printer. "Here is your boarding pass, Mrs. Sterling," she said, handing back the booklet. "You have access to the lounge near Gate 4. There's a buffet and comfortable seating. Boarding begins in 1 hour." "Thank you," I whispered. The relief was so intense, I nearly sat down on the floor. I made it through security. I was patted down because of my artificial hip, a humiliation I usually dreaded, but today I didn't care. I was through. I was on the other side. The lounge was quiet. I poured myself a coffee from a silver urn. It was strong and hot. I sat in a leather armchair by the window and watched the planes taxiing on the tarmac, great steel beasts waiting to take flight. My phone buzzed. I jumped, spilling a drop of coffee on my trousers. It was a text from Clara. "Mom, please, Robert is meeting with a judge this morning for an emergency injunction. He says you're stealing our inheritance. He's going to freeze everything by noon. Just come home. We can say it was a misunderstanding. Don't make us arrest you." Arrest me? The words floated before my eyes. My own daughter. The girl I had taught to braid hair. The girl I had held when her first husband left her. She was threatening to arrest me for spending my own money. I looked at the time. 6:15 a.m. The banks opened at 9. The courts opened at 9. By noon, they might actually do it. They might lock the vault. But by noon, I would be somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean. I didn't reply. I turned the phone off, completely off. I pulled the SIM card out with the little metal tool I had taped to the back of the case, just like the teenager at the phone store had showed me. I looked at the tiny chip. It contained my whole life. My contacts, my photos of the grandchildren who never called, the messages from the pharmacy, the history of a woman named Beatrice Sterling. I dropped the SIM card into my half-empty coffee cup. It sank into the brown liquid. "Goodbye," I said. Boarding the plane felt like entering a spaceship. I had never flown first class. The seat was enormous, soft leather that smelled of luxury. A flight attendant took my coat. Another brought me a glass of champagne before we even took off. "Is it too early?" the young man asked with a wink. "It is never too early when you are escaping prison," I said. He laughed, thinking it was a joke. I clinked the glass against the coaster and took a sip. The bubbles were sharp and cold. As the plane roared down the runway, pushing me back into the seat, I felt a tear slide down my nose. I wasn't crying for Robert or Clara. I wasn't crying for the house. I was crying for the years. The 40 years of Christmas dinners where I cooked for 3 days and they ate in 20 minutes. The years where I made myself small so they could feel big. The plane lifted. The ground fell away. The gray slush of the city, the suburbs where my house stood empty and sold, the roads where Robert was driving to a lawyer's office. It all became a patchwork quilt, then a mist, then nothing. We punched through the clouds into blinding sunlight. I closed my eyes and slept. For the first time in months, I slept without dreaming of leaking roofs or lonely holidays. I woke up as we were descending into Lisbon. The captain announced the temperature was 60 degrees. Rainy, but warm. Getting off the plane, my legs felt unsteady, but my spirit was iron. I navigated customs. The stamp in my passport, entrada, felt like a victory medal. I collected my suitcase. I walked out into the arrivals hall. It was chaotic, loud, and full of people speaking Portuguese. It sounded like music. I found a taxi driver, an older man with gray hair and a flat cap. Porto de Lisboa, please, I said, the cruise terminal. He nodded and took my bag. Queen Elizabeth? He asked. Yes, I said, the Queen. The drive took 20 minutes. We wound through narrow streets tiled in blue and white, past bakeries smelling of custard and cinnamon, and then I saw it. The ship. It was massive, a floating city of white steel and black trim with the red funnel reaching up to the gray sky. It looked solid. It looked impenetrable. It was docked in the wide river, looking out toward the ocean. My phone was dead and gutless in my purse. My house was gone. My family was at war with me. The taxi stopped. I paid the man and gave him a €50 tip because I liked his hat. I stood on the wet pavement, the wind whipping my hair across my face. The smell of the salt water filled my lungs. It was a clean smell, a wild smell. I walked toward the gangway. A crew member in a crisp white uniform stood at the bottom, holding a clipboard. "Welcome, madame," he said, smiling. "Name?" "Beatrice Sterling," I said, and for the first time in my life, when I said my name, I didn't feel like a mother or a widow or a victim. I felt like the owner of the world. He checked his list. "Ah, yes, the owner's suite. Welcome aboard, Mrs. Sterling. You are just in time for the departure." I stepped onto the gangway. The metal ramp vibrated under my feet. I didn't look back at the city. I didn't look back at the airport. I looked forward, at the long, polished deck of the ship that would take me away from everything I had ever known. I had sold the house. I had kept the money. And now I was going to spend it. All of it. But as I stepped onto the ship, a strange shiver went down my spine. Not fear, something else, a realization. I had won the battle, yes, I had escaped. But as the crewman took my bag and guided me toward the golden elevators of the atrium, I remembered Robert's voice one last time. "You'll die alone." I looked around the glittering lobby of the ship. Couples were holding hands, families were laughing. I squared my shoulders. Better to be alone in a palace, I thought, than a servant in your own home. I pressed the button for the top deck. The doors closed, and I began to rise. The elevator doors slid open with a whisper, revealing a hallway lined with carpet so thick it felt like walking on moss. A man in a tailcoat was waiting for me. He bowed slightly, a gesture I hadn't received since my wedding day 60 years ago. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, his voice hushed and respectful, "I am Arthur. I am Arthur. I will be your butler for the duration of the voyage." My butler? I almost laughed. Back home, I was the butler. I was the maid, the cook, and the accountant. I tightened my grip on my purse, fighting the urge to apologize for taking up his space. "Lead the way, Arthur," I said. He opened the double doors at the end of the corridor. I stepped inside, and my breath hitched in my chest. It wasn't a cabin. It was a palace. The walls were paneled in warm, honey-colored wood. There was a dining table set for 6, A living room with sofas the color of heavy cream and floor-to-ceiling glass doors that looked out onto a private teak balcony. Beyond that, the Tagus River sparkled under the gray sky, wide and inviting. I walked to the center of the room. I touched the back of a chair. It was solid mahogany, cool and smooth. "Is everything to your satisfaction, madame?" Arthur asked. "It is adequate," I said, channeling a woman I didn't know I could be. "I will leave you to settle in. We sail in 1 hour. There is chilled Bollinger in the ice bucket." When the door clicked shut, the silence rushed in. It wasn't the lonely, dusty silence of my big, empty house in the suburbs. This was a rich silence. It smelled of fresh lilies and sea salt. I walked to the bedroom. The bed was enormous, piled high with pillows. I sat on the edge. My legs were trembling again, not from fear this time, but from the sheer magnitude of what I had done. I thought of the house. By now, the real estate agent, a shark of a woman named Brenda, would be putting the "sold" sticker on the sign, or perhaps she had already done it. I closed my eyes and pictured the scene. Robert driving up the driveway, tires screeching. Clara in the passenger seat clutching her phone. They would see the sign. They would stop. They would stare. They wouldn't believe it. They would think it was a mistake, a prank. They would try their keys in the lock, but the locks would have been changed yesterday afternoon. I reached for the bottle of champagne. The cork popped with a sharp retort that echoed off the wood paneling. I poured a glass. My hand was steady. I walked out onto the balcony. The wind was picking up. The ship was waking up, a deep, rhythmic vibration humming through the steel beneath my feet. Below, on the dock, lines were being cast off. Thick rope splashed into the water. I stood at the railing, the wind whipping the hem of my coat. I looked down at the people of Lisbon, tiny figures going about their day. Somewhere, thousands of miles away, my phone was sitting in a cup of cold coffee in an airport trash can. Robert couldn't call me. Clara couldn't text me. The guilt couldn't reach me here. The ship's horn blasted, a low, mournful, powerful sound that vibrated in my sternum. We were moving, slowly at first, the gap between the ship and the land widening by inches, then feet. The water churned white and turquoise below. I took a sip of the champagne. It was dry and tasted like apples and toast. "Goodbye," I whispered to the land. Goodbye to the leaking roof. Goodbye to the silence of Christmas morning before they arrived. Goodbye to the feeling of being a burden. As the city of Lisbon began to shrink, turning into a postcard of pastel buildings and hills, I felt a sudden pang of panic. Robert's voice echoed in my head again. "You'll die alone." I looked at the empty chair next to me on the balcony. Yes, I thought, I might die alone. We all die alone, really. But I would not live alone. Not anymore. I was surrounded by 3,000 people. I had Arthur. I had the ocean. I went back inside and opened the folder I had carried with me. I pulled out the bank receipt. The transfer confirmation. The numbers were staggering. The house had sold for much more than I expected. A bidding war, Brenda had said. I looked at the balance. My children had spent years calculating this number. They had mentally spent it on new cars, tuition for their ungrateful children, renovations for kitchens they didn't cook in. They treated my life like a waiting room for their inheritance. I folded the paper. I tore it in half, then in quarters. I walked back to the balcony and held the confetti of paper over the railing. I opened my hand. The wind caught the pieces immediately, scattering them like white birds over the dark water. They danced for a moment, then vanished into the wake of the ship. I imagined Robert standing on my front porch, pounding on the door, screaming at the wood. I imagined him turning to Clara, his face purple, asking the question that had been the subtext of every hug, every Mother's Day card, every hurried visit for the last 20 years. Where is the money? I took another sip of champagne and let the bubbles tickle my nose. The salt spray misted my face, mixing with the tears I hadn't realized I was crying. But they weren't sad tears. They were cleansing tears. I looked out at the horizon, where the sky met the sea, endless and open. I smiled. It wasn't a polite smile. It wasn't a mother smile. It was a wicked, glorious, satisfied smile. "The money is right here, Robert," I said to the wind. "It is in the bubbles of this champagne. It is in the silk of these sheets. It is in the fuel burning in the engines of this ship." I turned my back on the receding land. I walked back into my warm, golden suite. I had a dinner reservation at 8 o'clock. I intended to order the most expensive thing on the menu, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to check the price. I was Beatrice Sterling, and I was finally, truly living.